Anyway, The Magician's Horse, from the Grey Fairy Book. Once upon a time there was a king who had 3 sons. Now it happened that one day these 3 princes went out hunting for a large forest at some distance from their father's palace. The youngest prince lost his way, so his brothers had to return home without him. For 4 days the prince wandered through the glades of the forest, sleeping on moss beneath the stars at night, and by day living on roots and wild berries. At last, on the morning of the 5th day, he came to a large open space in the middle of the forest. And here stood a stately palace, but neither within nor without was there any trace of human life. The prince entered the open door and wandered through the deserted rooms without seeing a living soul. At last he came on a great hall, and in the center of the hall was a table spread with dainty dishes and choice wines. The prince sat down and satisfied his hunger and thirst, and immediately afterwards the table disappeared from his sight. This struck the prince as very strange, imaginably so. But though he continued his search through all the rooms, upstairs and down, he could find no one to speak to. At last, just as he was beginning to get dark, he heard steps in the distance, and he saw an old man coming towards him up the stairs.
"What are you doing wandering around about my castle?" said the old man.
To whom the prince replied, "I lost my way hunting in the forest. If you will take me into your service, I would like to stay with you and serve you faithfully."
"Very well," said the old man. "You may enter my service. You will have to keep the stove always lit. You have to fetch the wood for it from the forest, and you will have to charge the black horse in the stables. I will pay you a florin a day, and at meal times you will always find the table in the hall spread with food and wine, and you can eat and drink as much as you require."
The prince was satisfied, and entered the old man's service, and promised to see that there was always wood on the stove, so that the fire should never die out. Now, though he did not know it, his new master was a magician. And the flame of the stove was a magic fire, and if it had gone out, the magician would have lost a great part of his power. One day the prince forgot, and let the fire burn so low that it nearly burnt out. Just as the flame was flickering, the old man stormed into the room.
"What do you mean by letting the fire burn so low?" he growled. "I have only arrived in the nick of time."
And while the prince hastily threw a log on the stove and blew the ashes to kindle the glow, his master gave him a severe box on the ear, and warned him that if it ever happened again, it would fare badly for him. One day the prince was sitting disconsolate in the stables when, to his surprise, the black horse spoke to him. "Come into my stall," it said. "I have something to say to you. Fetch my bridle and saddle from the cupboard, and put them on me. Take the bottle that is beside them. It contains an ointment which will make your hair shine like pure gold. Then put all the wood you gather on the stove, and keep it piled until it is quite high up." So the prince did what the horse told him. He saddled and bridled the horse, put the ointment on his hair until it shined like gold, and made such a big fire on the stove that the flames sprang up and set the roof on fire. In a few minutes the palace was burning like a huge bonfire. Oops. Then he hurried back to the stables, and the horse said to him, "There is one more thing you must do. In the cupboard you will find a looking-glass, a brush, and a riding whip. Bring them with you, mount on my back, and ride as hard as you can, for now the house is burning merrily." The prince did as the horse bade him. Scarcely had he got in the saddle than the horse took off and away, galloping at such a pace that, in a short time, the forest and all the country belonging to the magician lay far behind them. In the meantime, the magician returned to his palace, which he found in smoldering ruins. In vain he called for his servant. At last he went to look for him in the stables, and when he discovered that the black horse had disappeared too, he at once suspected that they had gone together. So he mounted a roan horse that was in the next stall, and set out in pursuit. As the prince rode, the quick ears of his horse heard the sound of pursuing feet. "Look behind you," he said, "and see if the old man is coming." And the prince turned in his saddle and saw a cloud of like smoke and dust in the distance. "We must hurry," said the horse. After they galloped for some time, the horse said again, "Look behind, and see if he is still in some distance." "He is quite close," answered the prince. "Then throw the looking-glass on the ground," said the horse. So the prince threw it, and when the magician came up, the roan horse stepped on the mirror, and crash! His foot went through the glass, and he stumbled and fell, cutting his feet so badly that there was nothing for the old man to do but to go slowly back with him to the stables and put new shoes on his feet. Then they started once more in pursuit of the prince, for the magician set great value on that horse, and was determined not to lose it. In the meanwhile, the prince had gone great distances, but the quick ears of the black horse detected the sound of falling feet from afar. "Dismount," he said to the prince. "Put your ear to the ground and tell me if you do not hear a sound." So the prince dismounted and listened. "I seem to hear the earth tremble," he said. "I think he cannot be far off." "Mount me at once," answered the horse, "and I will gallop as fast as I can." And he set off so fast that the earth seemed to fly from under his hooves. "Look back once more," he said after a short time, "and see if he is in sight." "I see a cloud and a flame," answered the prince, "but a long way off." "We must make haste," said the horse, and shortly after, again he said, "Look back again. He can't be far off now." The prince turned in his saddle and exclaimed, "He is close behind us. In a minute the flame of his horse's nostrils will reach us." "And throw the brush on the ground," said the horse. And the prince threw it, and in an instant the brush changed into a thick wood that even a bird could not have gotten through. And when the old man got up to it, the roan horse came suddenly to a standstill, and not able to advance a step into the thick tangle. So there was nothing for the magician to do but retrace his steps to fetch an axe, with which he cut himself a way through the woods. But it took him some time, during which the prince and the black horse got well ahead. But once more they heard the sound of pursuing feet. "Look back," he said, "and see if he is following." "Yes," answered the prince. "This time I hear him distinctly." "Let us hurry on," said the horse, and a little later he said, "Look back now, and see if he is in sight." "Yes," the prince said, turning round. "I see the flame. He is close behind us." "Then you must throw down the whip," answered the horse, and in the twinkling of an eye the whip was changed into a broad river. When the old man got up to it, he urged the roan horse into the water, but as the water mounted higher and higher, the magic flame which gave the magician all his power grew smaller and smaller, till with a fizz it went out, and the old man and his roan horse sank into the river and disappeared. When the prince looked round, they were no longer to be seen. "Now," said the horse, "you may dismount. There is nothing more to fear, for the magician is dead. Beside that brook you will find a willow wand. Gather it and strike the earth with it, and it will open, and you will find a door at your feet." When the prince had struck the earth with the wand, the door appeared, and opened into a large, vaulted stone hall. "Lead me into the hall," said the horse. "I will stay there, but you must go through the fields till you reach the garden, in the midst of which you will find the king's palace. When you get there, you must ask to be taken into the king's service. Goodbye, and don't forget me." So they parted. But first the horse made the prince promise not to let anyone in the palace see his golden hair. So he bound the scarf around it, like a turban, and the prince set out through the fields till he reached a beautiful garden. And beyond the garden he saw the walls and the towers of a stately palace. At the garden gate he met the gardener, who asked him what he wanted. "I want to take service with the king," replied the prince. "Well, you may stay and work under me in the garden," said the man, for the prince was dressed like a poor man. He could not tell that he was a king's son. "I need someone to weed the ground and to sweep the dead leaves from the paths. You shall have a florin a day, a horse to help you in the cart to leaves away, and food and drink." So the prince consented and set about his work. But when his food was given to him, he only ate half of it. The rest he carried to the vaulted hall beside the brook, and gave it to the black horse. As he did this every day, the horse thanked him for his faithful friendship. One evening, as they were together, after his work in the garden was over, the horse said to him, "Tomorrow a large company of princes and great lords are coming to your king's palace. They are coming from far and near as wooers for the 3 princesses. They will all stand in a row in the courtyard of the palace, and the 3 princesses will come out, and each one will carry a diamond apple in her hand, which she will throw at the air. At whoever's feet the apple falls will be the bridegroom of that princess. You must be close by the garden at your work. The apple of the youngest princess, who is the most beautiful of the sisters, will roll past the wooers and stop in front of you. Pick it up at once and put it into your pocket." The next day, the wooers were all assembled in the courtyard of the castle. Everything happened just as the horse had said. The princesses threw the apples into the air, and the diamond apple, as the youngest princess, rolled past all the wooers and out onto the garden. It stopped at the feet of the young gardener, who was busy sweeping the leaves away. In a moment he had stooped down and picked up the apple and put it in his pocket. As he stooped, the scarf around his head slipped a little to one side, and the princess caught sight of his golden hair and loved him from that moment. She likes blondes. But the king was very sad, for the youngest daughter was the one he loved best. But there was no help for it. The next day, the 3-fold wedding was celebrated in the palace. And after the wedding, the youngest princess returned with her husband to the small hut in the garden where he lived. Some time after this, the people of the neighboring country went to war with the king, and he set out to battle, accompanied by the husbands of his 2 eldest daughters, mounted on stately steeds. But the husband of the youngest daughter had nothing but an old broken-down horse, which helped him in his garden work. And the king, who was ashamed of his son-in-law, refused to give him another. He was so determined not to be left behind, he went to the garden, mounted the sorry nag, and set out. But scarcely had he ridden a few yards before the horse stumbled and fell. So he dismounted and went down to the brook, to where the black horse lived in the vaulted hall. And the horse said to him, "Saddle and bridle me, and then go to the next room, and you will find a suit of armor and a sword. Put them on, and we will ride forth together to battle." And the prince did as he was told, and when he had mounted the horse, the armor glittered in the sun, and he looked so brave and so handsome that no one would have recognized him as the gardener who swept away the dead leaves in the past. The horse bore him away at a great pace, and when they reached the battlefield they saw the king was losing the day. So many of his warriors had been slain. But when the warrior on his black charger and glittering armor appeared on the scene, hewing right and left with his sword, the enemy was so dismayed and fled in all directions. Leaving the king the master of the field. When the king and his two son-in-laws, when they saw the deliverer, shouted, and all that was left of the army joined the cry, "A god has come to our rescue!" And they would have surrounded him, but his black horse rose in the air and bore him out of their sight. Soon after this, part of the country rose in rebellion against the king, and once more he and his two son-in-laws had to go forth to battle. And the son-in-law who was disguised as a gardener wanted to fight too. So he came to the king and said, "Dear father, let me ride with you against your enemies." "I don't want a blockhead like you in the fight with me," answered the king. "Besides, I haven't got a horse fit for you. But see, there's a carter on the road carting hay. You may take his horse." So the prince took the carter's horse, but the poor beast was tired and old, and after it had gone a few yards, it stumbled and fell. So the prince returned sadly to the garden and watched the king ride forth at the head of the army, accompanied by his two son-in-laws. When they were out of sight, the prince betook himself to the vaulted chamber by the brookside, and having taken counsel of the faithful black horse, put on the glimmering suit of armor, and was borne on the back of the horse through the air, to where the battle was being fought. And once more he routed the king's enemies, hacking to right and hacking to left with his sword. And again they all cried, "A god has come to our rescue!" But when they tried to detain him, and the black horse again rose into the air and bore him out of sight. When the king and his son-in-laws returned home, they could talk of nothing but the hero who had fought for them, and all wondered who he could be. Shortly afterwards, the king of a neighboring country declared war, and once more the king and his son-in-laws and his subjects had to prepare themselves for battle. And once more the prince begged to ride with him, but the king said he had no horse to spare for him. "But," he added, "you may take the horse of the woodsman who brings the wood for the forest. It is good enough for you." The prince took the woodsman's horse, but it was so old and useless that it could not carry him beyond the castle gates. So he betook himself once more to the vaulted hall, where the black horse was prepared a still more magnificent suit for him than the one he had worn on the previous occasions. And when he had put it on and mounted the back of the horse, it bore him straight into the battlefield, and once more he scattered the king's enemies, fighting single-handed in their ranks, and they all fled in all directions. But it happened that one of the enemies struck with his sword and wounded the prince in the leg. And the king took his own pocket-handkerchief, with his name and crown embroidered on it, because kings, and bound it around the wounded leg. And the king would fain have compelled him to mount a litter and be carried straight to the palace, and two of his knights were to lead the black charger to the royal stables. But the prince put his hand on the mane of his faithful horse and managed to pull himself into the saddle, and the horse mounted into the air with him. Then they all shouted and cried, "The warrior who fought for us is a god! He must be a god!" And throughout all the kingdom nothing else was spoken about, and all the people said, "Who can the hero be who has fought for us in so many battles? He cannot be a man. He must be a god." And the king said, "If only I could see him once more, and if it turned out that after all he was a man and not God, I would reward him with half of my kingdom." Now, when the prince had reached his home, the gardener's hut, where he kept his wife, he was weary. He lay down on his bed and slept. And his wife noticed the handkerchief bound around his wounded leg, and she wondered what it could be. And then she looked at it more closely and saw in the corner that it was embroidered with her father's name and the royal crown. She ran straight to the palace and told her father, and he and his 2 son-in-laws followed her back to the house. And there the gardener lay asleep in his bed. And the scarf that he always wore around his head had slipped off, and his golden hair gleamed on the pillow. And they all recognized that he was the hero who had fought and had won so many battles for them. Then there was a great rejoicing throughout the land, and the king rewarded his son-in-law with half his kingdom, and he and his wife reigned happily over it.